Hi everyone, welcome to lecture 6. Today we'll be talking about skeletal muscle mechanics, and then we're going to continue on into motor control. In this lecture we will be continuing to talk about skeletal muscle structure and function. In our last lecture we ended talking about the length-tension relationship of muscle fibers, and we're going to continue from there, going into our mechanical model next. So if you remember, a quick summary is that if we put a slight stretch onto muscle fibers, we can generate more force. If we shorten the muscle fibers from resting length, we will actually decrease the force as if it were at resting length. So let's move forward. Muscles contain elastic structures that can be stretched, they can absorb energy, and enhance development of force. The elastic properties to muscle have been divided into a number of different components: the series elastic and paraelastic components, as well as the contractile components. These components work in concert with the contractile components to produce force. So our series elastic and our parallel elastic components work together with the contractile components of the muscle cell to produce force. Okay, so here is our mechanical model of skeletal muscle. Our contractile component, and it's represented right here. We have our series elastic component, which is right here, which is next to the contractile components. And then we have our parallel elastic components on the opposite side. The contractile components include the various structures of the sarcomere, so all of the actin and myosin and so forth are considered part of the contractile components. Our series elastic component includes the tendons and cross bridges of the muscle fibers. This is the most important component to translating stretch to force. So this is what's going to stretch and translate us into force when this contracts. So that's an important aspect. The parallel elastic component is on the opposite side over here, and it includes collagenous structures such as the fascicular membranes, and this provides stability and protection of the muscle. So the purpose of the parallel elastic components is stability and protection of the muscle fiber itself. So here we have the contractile component, which includes actin, myosin, Z disc to Z disc, the I band, A band, I bands, A band, H zone, and all that. This is considered our contractile components, and we also have a series elastic component, again, which is our tendons and cross bridges, most important component to translating stretch to force. Parallel elastic components include the collagenous structures such as fascicular membranes. So here, if we want to look inside a muscle cell or a muscle, and this is kind of what it's zoomed in as, this is our contractile component with our actin, myosin cross bridges. We have our series elastic component, which stretches and translates stretch into force when we contract. And here's our parallel elastic component. This is our protective mechanism over here. This protects our muscle cells. It provides stability and protection of this muscle. So let's continue to talk about the mechanical model. Elastic muscle energy enhances muscle force development during the stretch shortening cycle. During sudden movements, for example, let's talk about jumping or throwing, the elastic structures within the muscle cell are stretched. The stretch presents potential energy that can enhance the force produced by the contractile component. So that's where we were talking about that length-tension relationship. If we put a slight stretch onto that muscle cell or those muscle fibers, we can enhance force. So that stretch represents potential energy that can enhance the force of production to the contractile component. Immediately after the muscle is stretched, it's going to actively contract, with the recoil of the elastic elements assisting in force development. The storage and reuse of elastic energy during that stretch shortening cycle are influenced by fire type and jumping techniques. All right, so colleagues here in a study of 1998, they demonstrated that muscle fatigue is accompanied by a decrease in the performance of this stretch shortening cycle. So ultimately, the muscle's capacity for increasing force by using elastic recoil may be a factor in decreased performance as athletes tire. So it's not going to be able to store or use as much energy as the athlete tires out. So let's use some examples. When jumping in basketball, for example, let's use the high jump, leg muscles are stretched immediately prior to the jump. The elastic loading of the leg enhances force development during the jump. Hitting a baseball or throwing a discus also includes a stretch shortening cycle. For example, movement of the legs and the hips precedes movement of the upper body and elastically loads the torso, resulting in a whip-like motion. So more power is generated by this motion than would have been possible than just using the upper body muscles alone. If you're able to, try that out. Try getting up, and if you're going to pretend to hit a baseball or throw a disc. Movement of the legs and hips, notice that it's going to precede the movement of the upper body. You're going to move your legs and hips before you swing the rest of your torso and your upper body into a whip-like motion. You'll notice more power is generated by this motion than it would have been possible just using the upper body muscles alone. Now, don't use your legs now. Keep your feet firm, placed onto the ground. Don't twist ahead of time or anything, or step or twist your torso. Just try to use your arms and swing through on your upper torso. And which one produced more force? Which one did you feel that you produced more force? All right, so let's review and give a reminder to what the latent period is for skeletal muscle contraction. We talked about this last lecture, but I'm going to continue with that right now. So the latent period is this right here, this little bar right here. This is our latent period. That represents the time between the actual stimulation of the contraction and the actual movement of the resistance. So this actually is the contraction, which is when we're moving the resistance. So there's a time lag there, and that's very important. We can manipulate this time lag, and that will indicate muscular performance. So let's talk about manipulating that. So let's talk about what a preloaded muscle is. A preloaded muscle is a muscle that is supporting the resistance prior to the initiation of contraction. So this means our series elastic elements are already stretched in proportion to the resistance. So let's go back. So here, a preloaded muscle means that the series elastic component here is already stretched in proportion to the load or the resistance. So this is stretched in proportion to the load that is being placed on it. Okay, so now what happens to the latent period if we add resistance? Nothing's going to happen to that time or that latent period, because now the series elastic components are already stretched in proportion to the new resistance. So now the latent period still only involves our contractile machinery, just like before, because this series elastic components are already stretched. So if we already have a stretched muscle and we're already ready for that load, adding a little bit more resistance, the muscle is already stretched in proportion to the load it's going to lift. Okay, so let's talk about what an afterloaded muscle is. An afterloaded muscle is where the series elastic components are not stretched in proportion to the load. So now the latent period will be longer because now it contains two factors, where a preloaded muscle is already stretched in proportion to the load and is ready to move that resistance. Our afterload muscle is not. So the latent period will be longer because of two factors. One, it contains the contractile machinery like before, but now before you can move the load, the series elastic components have to be stretched in proportion to that load. So now what happens if we increase the load? That latent period is actually going to become longer because it will take longer for those series elastic components to be stretched. Because if they weren't stretched yet, we still need to stretch them. So we're adding that time into that latent period. But if we add an even heavier resistance to an afterloaded muscle, then that's going to add even more time on because we were never stretched in proportion to the load to begin with. So if we increase that load, that latent period is going to become longer. It may take the same amount of time to stimulate the contractile apparatus, but it will take twice as long to stretch the series elastic components. So a major difference between a preload and an afterloaded muscle is the time duration of that latent period and what happens to that latent period if in fact the resistance goes up. Okay, so here's a diagram ultimately showing the preloaded versus afterloaded muscle. Here we have resting. So resting, we are not asking it to contract or lift any sort of resistance here. So if we look at a preloaded muscle, it is resting, but is stretched in proportion to the load before we contract. But if we have an afterloaded muscle here, we are doubling ultimately, like I said, we need to stretch prior to moving that resistance. So here you need to add it on and then we can contract. So an afterloaded muscle, when you ask it to move, it was not stretched in proportion to the load. So now that latent period is going to be a little bit longer. So what is the latent period again? That the time between the stimulus and actual movement of the resistance. So that latent period is going to be a little bit longer if we're not stretched in proportion to moving that resistance. Okay, so we're going to move on to muscle energetics and metabolism, but when we talk about preload and afterload, I just want to note those two terms are going to come back to us when we talk about cardiovascular physiology. Preload and afterload are two totally different terms when we talk cardiovascular physiology, especially in our heart. So there's skeletal muscle components, which are preload and afterload, which we just talked about, and then later on we'll talk about the preload and afterload within the heart themselves. Okay, so moving on to muscle energetics and metabolism. In resting muscle, most of the energy or ATP that we have stored there is used to operate the sodium-potassium exchange pump, which helps maintain our concentration gradients across the sarcolemma. So that whole last lecture I talked about potassium and sodium and potassium relationships and our sodium-potassium exchange pump. If you recall, the sodium-potassium exchange pump requires ATP. Why? Because we're going against the gradient. We are moving now 3 sodiums out of the cell and allowing 2 potassiums back into the cell. But still, that remains resting membrane potential. It helps still maintain its negativity because we're taking something 3 positive out and only 2 bringing it in, giving us a net loss of 1. So in a contracting muscle, the sodium-potassium pump uses ATP at a higher rate because it must counteract the additional ionic movement resulting from the action potential. Active muscles also use more ATP for regathering calcium than does the resting muscle. The energy requirements of active muscle are greatly influenced by the rate of the cross-bridge cycling. So the concentration of ATP in skeletal muscle is about 5 millimoles. This can only support up to a few seconds of activity. So when we talked about energy systems and immediate energy systems, how ATP was first, again, that only can a couple seconds of energy, we have ATP stored. Then again, we move on to our creatine phosphate system, our myokinase system, as well as then we would move into anaerobic glycolysis. Okay, so skeletal muscle fiber types and energy metabolism. We're going to talk about the different types of muscle fibers and the different energy requirements for each. So different muscle groups serve different functions and display corresponding contracting proteins. So what are some examples? Obviously, our biceps and triceps work differently than our core muscles, as well as our stabilizing muscles. Our calf muscles are made up of different muscle fiber types than let's say, our stability back muscles. So we're going to get into that in a little bit. So functional specialization of muscles is possible because 3 types of muscle fibers exist, and relative numbers of each fiber type are different in different muscles. So when we get into it a little bit, we're going to talk about how, like I said, calf muscles are going to have a different makeup of those muscle fibers. They may have more of one muscle fiber type compared to the other. Same with like our stability muscles. So if we were to look at some of our hip muscles, our lower back muscles that are pretty much just working off oxidative metabolism, if we were to take a muscle biopsy, we are going to get different fiber types compared to what would be in a muscle sample from a calf muscle. So fiber types are distinguished by several factors, including their metabolic pathway used for each energy and their resistance to fatigue. That's what we're going to get into next. So that's why it was very important for you all to know about energy systems and how the energy systems work in the body, because we're just building upon that. And we're going to be talking about how different muscle fibers use different metabolic pathways.